Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And this is the place where we search for the theories that are going to change the world. And today we have an extraordinary treat for you. We have with us Lance Weaver, who's been on the show twice before. Once he presented an extraordinary theory of pole shift during the last ice age. He's a geologist by training, which I don't think I'm allowed to say that.
Don't say it. He works for somebody we can't talk about.
He has professional qualifications that make him uniquely capable of presenting this story, which we cannot mention on this show for professional reasons. But
that observation, by the way, basically boils down to the fact that the obvious imprint of the glacier isn't centered over the North Pole, which throws the entire theory of the glaciation into complete disarray. And it's very difficult to argue against something very different than the traditional geological structure, because ocean currents don't seem to cut it, and why in the heck is the glacier not centered over the cold part of the Earth?
And he also came by to present a theory about a connection between the Old World and the New World in pre-Columbian contact times. So he made this really compelling case that if you look through the artifacts and the art styles of the Mesopotamian, that they have a lot of overlap with the art styles of Mesoamerica.
Not just stylings, but literal figures and symbols, and it's pretty wild. Birdman.
Like Birdman riding snakes carrying handbags. It's a strangely complex motif to have just show up twice with no real overlap. And so you can check out both of those conversations, but today we are talking about the fact that there are 500 years of history that need to be deleted from our chronology of the ancient world. And the way that Lance came to this is kind of wild. So there's this document called the Kolbrin Bible that is of strange provenance. So there's this group of monks of northern England called the Chaldeans or the Chaldees that have been maintaining this text that is purported to be an ancient text that reveals ancient mythological stories about the world. And most people kind of dismiss it outright. But Lance is not the type of person to dismiss something without taking a close look at it. And when he started reading through it, he started to notice that there were actually chronologies that were presented in this book that, if they were correct, would radically change the history that we have for the Middle East from about 500 BC to about 1000 BC.
Specifically, they would rectify the differences between the King's List in Egypt and the biblical dates from the Old Testament, which is interesting because both of these are sort of inherited series of dates that have been, in some sense, passed down through the ages, but they square on many points except for this 500 years. And whether or not the Kolbrin Bible is a legit document or not, it got Lance thinking.
We kind of go over the connection between the Old World and the New World at the beginning, and then we get into the Kolbrin Bible and what it is that he saw there, and the ways that he thinks that it's necessary to adjust the story of what happened in the Middle East during that 500-year period.
The result is a really interesting reset of the geopolitical picture around the first millennium BC, when you actually perhaps have this transnational civilization that's operating between Canaan and Egypt and is more homogeneous than we might have thought, and perhaps corresponds to the King's period in the Bible.
And it's just wild because the thing that Lance does is he finds something that he's really interested in and just digs until he can figure it out. And I think that he presents a compelling picture. There's other people, including Velikovsky, that have suggested that perhaps there is a different timeline that we should be using for this period. And not only does Lance have this textual analysis, but he also makes the point that the evidence that's used, radiocarbon dating, to make this chronology of this time period actually has some pretty serious problems. And so this fits right in with our mission of finding theories that are going to change the world, because if we have to change this period of history, 500 years, and completely redefine it for the Middle East, it turns out that the same problem arises all over the world. And so if we've just written in 500 years of history that didn't actually happen into every single place on Earth, that's pretty wild.
Absolutely. Guys, remember, this podcast has no sponsors. We are not selling anything that we didn't make ourselves here on the program.
There are no nutritional supplements. There are no grounding mattresses. There are no boner pills. There are no questionable...
Gambling kings.
Exactly.
But we do have big plans, and we want to do a lot more than we're doing already, and that's going to take some fuel. So if you're enjoying this program, if you want to see more live events, if you want to see us doing more live interviews and ramping up the quality of this production, you can support us over at patreon.com/DemystifySci directly. And if you do that, then we'd love to meet you. So come and hang out at our weekly Sunday salon, where we get together and discuss all the topics on the show and where we should go next with them. You'd also support the show by picking up some gear down below. We've got some new sweatshirt designs down in the YouTube shelf. We also have our first musical album out on vinyl, and we are super proud of this record. It is a beautiful piece of rock and roll, and you can spin it on your record player. We have those also for sale. Down in the shelf below.
If you're using an ad blocker, you might not see the shelf, but the link is also in the description.
If you don't have any cash and you can't fuel this project today, maybe you can later, you can tell people about it. You can just share one of these episodes with somebody who you think needs to get in on this conversation. That goes a long way. It's completely free. And if you haven't already subscribed and
giving it a like.
I hate even asking you guys for likes. It's such a ridiculous form of speech. Please like me. Yeah, it's preposterous. But honestly, do subscribe. That helps. The numbers do make it easier for us to attract guests for the show in the future.
I don't know. Start a bot farm and have it listen to the podcast all the time. That helps too.
You know, I've seen some breakdowns of how the bot farms don't really help your podcast in the long run. So maybe don't do that. But
it sounds like somebody who wants to maintain their competitive bot advantage would say.
There's a really interesting YouTube video where this guy spends like several $1 million to try out all of the subterfugious ways of gaining followers on YouTube, and none of them work out, basically. It's quite interesting. I'll show it to you later. Anyways, maybe you have a theory and you want to share it with the world. I would recommend that you join our little community going on every month called Paradigm Drift, where we get together and people put their names in a hat. We pull out as many names as we can get through in 2 hours and give them a minute to present their theory, and then we'll interview them for a little bit afterwards. And it is a riot. It is very fun. So you can hang out in the chat and we will evaluate people's ideas, learn how to think, figure out what makes sense, what doesn't all together. I would love to see you there. The next taping is on October 17th. That's at 7 p.m. Pacific.
And for now, enjoy the conversation with Lance Weaver about the 500 years of history that needed to be deleted from the record.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Well, yeah, why don't you just catch us up on where we left off last time you were
on? Okay. So start right here.
Start right here.
Right,
start
guys,
at the beginning. The beginning is always the best place to start.
It's always fun hanging out. So thanks for having me. So today, if we could just talk about, I'm kind of thinking about three things, One would be starting off with the stuff that I talked about last time I was on the podcast with pre-Columbian Trans-Oceanic travel. So I'll talk about, I'll recap that because we did a whole show on that. And I think that evidence is pretty awesome, but it really fits into our main topic, which is the Kolbrin. And the Kolbrin, I'll kind of go back and forth between it and the other research it's kind of led me to, which is kind of my revised Egyptian chronology. So I spent a lot of time trying to create a revised Egyptian chronology. And there's a number of authors who've kind of worked on that. And my revised chronology, I'm not positive because I haven't really read all of his stuff, but I think that it's actually pretty similar to what Velikovsky has for his revised chronology.
Can I ask you a really stupid question already? Which is, what's wrong with the standard mainstream chronology?
To mainstream archaeologists and historians, nothing, right? Because they think that it's the most reliable. But especially if you're the main problem for most people and why most people would create a revised chronology is because in the existing chronology, everything in the Bible kind of seems to line up with what we find in Egypt until you hit David. And like in that period between, halfway between really kind of the early Babylonian period, and then definitely when you hit David, it just falls apart. Like the stuff that you see happening up in Mesopotamia is completely, in Canaan, is totally different than anything you'd find in the Bible. And so people are like, well, why is that? Is that all mythological? Like, is the story of David, especially, because in the Bible, it's like saying that David and Saul, they're creating this huge empire and they're conquering all the way from the Euphrates to the Nile. And there's no evidence at all in the archaeological record, given the chronology that we have right now. Like the chronology that we have right now is based almost entirely on Manetho. And strangely enough, like this is kind of weird. This is because the chronology that we have right now was created by biblicists, right? By like religionists. So like starting with Josephus 2,000 years ago, he relies on Manetho and kind of lays out this idea of like how their history is intertwined with Egyptian history.
Sorry, who's Manetho?
So Manetho is an Egyptian historian who lived about 250, 320 BC. And he created the largest treatise on Egyptian history. And he made this massive king list, a timeline, which is the basis of every modern Egyptian chronology.
And what was he sourcing for that? Was he just going off of oral history, or what was this coming down
This
from?
was during the Greek era of Egyptian history, where the Greeks had, the Ptolemaic era. So they had conquered Egypt. So he's a Greek Egyptian, and he's writing in Greek language, but he's going actually to all the temples in Egypt and consulting with their records and writing them down. So he is like an Egyptian expert, right? Because he is Egyptian, Greek Egyptian. And so if you go to, I think the best resource for this is a website called Pharaohs. Like they've got such a great chronology on there and such a concise, great explanation of all the historical sources that we get our chronology from. And you can kind of see how Manetho works out and how it's been correlated with other king lists that we found archaeologically, right? Because there's a lot of king lists on murals, both hieroglyphic, inscribed in stone, and also written. There's probably like 4 main king lists. And so archaeologists have correlated Manetho's writings with those king lists to try and kind of solidify them. And there's gaps here and there and problems. And it's those gaps and problems, like I'm sure you kind of know just from browsing Egyptian history, how you've got like these dynasties, the first through like 30th dynasties. And then there's these first intermediate period, second intermediate period, third intermediate period. Well, what those intermediate periods are is holes. They're like lacunas. They're gaps where there's kind of issues in the archaeological and conscription records that we have. And so when it comes to someone trying to come with a revised chronology, they usually kind of focus on, well, what's going on with these intermediate periods? Because even Manetho says, hey, you know what? I've got all these dynasties, but some of them overlap, and I've got missing holes here and missing times. And so, but that doesn't make my record untrue. But his records have been preserved to us through early Christian writers. So the first was Josephus. He lived at the time of Christ. So he gave, quoted quite a bit of Manetho to try and prove that the Israeli race was as ancient as the Egyptian race. And then after that, we've got Eusebius, right? And Eusebius and who's the other? Africanus and Eusebius. They're both early Christian writers. And so they live like, I'm trying to remember, it's like the 5th century AD or something like that. And so they're transcribing almost verbatim, but there are differences in their works, Manetho's writings as well. So we don't have any like original of Manetho. We have Eusebius and Africanus's their transcription of Manetho, right? But like I said, there's some major issues in that, and so lots of people have been like, okay, well, these holes that we see, and the biggest one, like I've read all of their works, and they're long, right? You're reading 1,000 pages of history to get into this kind of stuff. So what I thought was weird is this, like you start to get really late in their history, and then you start to compare it with Herodotus, and he's the second major ancient writer that we have who really tells the Egyptian history, right? And so Herodotus lives at 480 BC or something, and we have his actual original work. So it's not kind of like a retelling like Eusebius and Africanus did with Manetho. the original. And since he's the oldest, this is what I had an issue with, and most people have an issue with. Most historians completely dismiss Herodotus's work as just kind of like garbage. But it's like, well, he's like 100 to 150 years older than Manetho. So why trust Manetho, who's later, more than Herodotus? And Herodotus is arguably the better historian. He has massive history books of the entire region. He's got histories of the Lydians and the Babylonians and Greeks. It's just history after history. So it's like, why are we dismissing his stuff and say that his is garbage when Manetho's comes later? And there's good reasons for that. But I just want to lay this as the foundation so that people understand this. Like, there really is a good reason to question the existing timeline and to go back and for everyone to kind of throw their shoe into the ring and be like, hey, there might actually be some better chronologies here that we could revise.
You mentioned at the beginning that it didn't square with the King David story, or was the King Saul story?
Yeah.
I remember reading about that on Wikipedia at some point, and it seems like the archaeological community is kind of split on whether it's a historical figure or not. Is that true?
Yeah, totally. And that split is probably almost exclusively along religious lines. Right. And so, 100 years ago, all the archaeologists in Egypt were biblicists. They were Christians, and so they're kind of trying to prove the Bible, and they're building on Manetho to try and prove the Bible. And it's like there's been this 360 now where I don't know if it's 50-50. I think it's probably more like 70-30, or maybe even 80-20, where the Christian kind of religionist scientists, they each have their thing like, yeah, we think they're here with Solomon, Saul, King David, they're all here, and we kind of try and fit them in here. But the objective, non-religious historians and archaeologists are kind of like, not really there. I'm not seeing it. And
like
so,
I'm just trying to understand the mismatch a little bit better.
Like the archaeological, so I think that what Lance is saying is that there is an agreement in the historical accounts of the Bible until you get to King David, and King David is supposed to be this conqueror that builds an empire. But at the time that he is supposed to be building the empire, there's no archaeological evidence for that empire having been built. Is that what you're saying?
exactly, because his empire was supposedly, in the Bible, it says he conquered into Egypt, into the Nile
Can you
River.
remind me, what approximate era this is? My biblical history kind of sucks. Was this after
BC.
the Babylonian exile, the Second Temple and stuff?
This is earlier.
Before that. So
Yes, this is all predating. This is 1000 BC. So the Babylonian exile, 600 BC. So we're at 1000 BC. There in the 1100 to 900 BC is that era of Saul, who's the first one. He's like the first dynastic king of Israel who just conquers everyone.
Got it.
And then David follows on his heels, and then Solomon follows on his heels. And Solomon's marrying, the people in Cush, all the way up in Ethiopia. He's marrying Pharaohs. And if you remember, that the really crazy part is that as soon as we have Solomon, so we have Saul, David, and Solomon. And by Solomon, supposedly they're ruling from the Euphrates in Syria down to the Nile in Egypt. And they're doing dynastic marriages between all of these people. And then Solomon's children, his two sons, right, split the empire. And when he splits the empire, then it gets really involved in Egyptian history, because between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, one of them runs to Egypt to escape, and then creates an alliance with Egypt, right? So Israel, after Solomon, splits into the northern and the southern kingdoms, and Jeroboam and Rehoboam are the kings of those northern and southern kingdoms. And the northern kingdom immediately creates an alliance with Egypt, the Egyptian pharaoh, and then those two together come and conquer the southern kingdom. They completely sack Solomon's temple and carry away a bunch of the sacred artifacts back to Egypt, right? And then kind of create some kind of a vassalage where the southern kingdom is even having to be kind of subservient a little bit to Egypt, even though they gained their independence more. And the northern kingdom from that point really stays an arm, essentially, a vassal of Egypt, all the way until the Egyptian or the Babylonian captivity. So they're intertwined.
Is this related to the Hyksos period of Egypt?
Yes, totally. Okay, and this is huge, right? Because the Hyksos, everyone knows about the Hyksos. Huge amounts of data, about the Hyksos. There are murals on the wall. They show these Asiatic invaders. There's absolutely no mistake and we learn about it from Manetho to begin with, that the Hyksos existed. right? We know their cities, we know their kings, we know their artifacts, we know their ties to Canaan for sure. But where it gets crazy is that way early on, Josephus, right at the time of Christ, he's quoting Manetho, and he's trying to find Israelite history, and he says, "Well, see these Hyksos that Manetho talks about? That's the Israelites." He says the Hyksos were Moses in Egypt, right? And so up until the archaeological times, that's kind of what everyone thought. Like, oh, the Hyksos, that's what Josephus said. The Hyksos are Moses and the children of Israel captive in Egypt, which is supposed to be around 1500 BC, right? 500 years before David. And so everyone thought that. And then when we start getting to the archaeology and start kind of like dating these things, it's like, wait, that doesn't fit, because the Bible says that they were supposed to be captive in Egypt at 1500 BC, but the Hyksos come around from about, 1200 to 1000. They're kind of in a different period.
Well, the Bible doesn't have dates in it, right? But you're just inferring from the chronology of
So the Bible
David,
has dates.
blah blah blah, and etc. The Bible has dates in it.
The Bible has dates. You can piece them together pretty easily. So the Bible's date is the most reliable. The early chronologies were all hung on the Bible because its dates are better than Manetho's dates. Manetho gives dates for each king, right? But it's kind of hard to like put those together because of those lacunas or because of those gaps. So even if you know how long each pharaoh reigned for, your chronology is very difficult to put together. Whereas the Bible not only has dates for all of the kings and their reigns, it also says how long each period was. And so its chronology is far more laid out, even though there's some debate there. Its chronology is far more solid than Manetho's chronology. So for the last 150 years, 200 years since archaeology started, maybe probably with Napoleon in Egypt, the people have been trying to fit the Egyptian chronology into the biblical chronology. And it's only been maybe the last, 60 years that the Egyptian archaeologists are like, this just doesn't work. This whole Hyksos as Moses and the children of Israel does not work. And the biggest thing is just like, well, Hyksos were invaders. They ruled Egypt. Like they invaded and completely conquered parts of Egypt and ruled in Egypt. So how is that anything like what the Bible says about Moses and them being slaves? And so there's a big debate there that started. And the majority, I would say the great majority of archaeologists who aren't really religiously motivated say, yeah, the Bible just isn't right here. Bible's got issues.
So where do you fall on this?
So where I fall on this is that when I read the Kolbrin, right, I'm aware of this whole debate. I'm kind of trying to piece it together myself. And I read the Kolbrin, and there's this single section in the Kolbrin, which we're going to talk about here in a second what the Kolbrin is. But this section of the Kolbrin gives an account. It doesn't even say David by name, but gives an account where it's like, this is an Egyptian record, and the Egyptians say that there was an Abramite king, right, up in the Levant, and that this king had its daughters ravished. And I can't remember the other details. I'll look it up here in a second. And it says, but he lived in the days of Amos. And when I read that, I'm like, whoa, that's obviously talking about David. Like there's no one, like that whole story of Tamar and his daughters is unmistakable. So that's obviously talking about David, even though it's kind of a subtle allusion to it. In the days of Amos? No one thinks that. And so I'm like, that's crazy. Well, I've been trying to piece this together. Let me just go with that. Let me just suppose that maybe that's true and have that be one of my anchors to piece this together.
And Amos is one of the Egyptian rulers, right?
And he's a huge Egyptian ruler, right? He is the head of the 21st dynasty. And so the New Kingdom, which is when the Valley of the Kings, like if you go to Egypt, aside from the pyramids, when you get up into Luxor and the Valley of the Kings and all these massive palaces, that's all from the New Kingdom. And he began all that. He unified Egypt after a huge intermediate period, after an attack from the Hyksos. He reconquered Egypt from the Hyksos.
Okay, so I think we have the destination laid out on the table. Let's rewind a little bit and talk about this old world, new world connection before we get into the Kolbrin and all of the king lists and everything else, because I think that is important for you.
Okay, yeah. And let me correct. I think I said Amos is 20. Amos is the 18th dynasty, so people can look that up. Okay, so back to this kind of our last presentation where we talked about this Trans-Oceanic connection, and then tying that into the Kolbrin, right? Because a big question, I think, in this discussion as we go through the Kolbrin, as this compilation of ancient manuscripts that ended up in Britain, of all places. It not only tells this correlation between Amos and David, it also has at least one and probably two different accounts of Trans-Oceanic travel, right? So it's telling about people who went to the New World. And obviously it doesn't call it the New World, but it's obvious they're talking about groups that went to the New World. And it's intertwined with Egypt because the first, probably, I don't know, half, maybe even a little bit more of the Kolbrin is all Egyptian manuscripts. So what it purports to be, right, is like this compilation of Egyptian manuscripts, and yet from ancient, right? These are like really old, and it doesn't give any dates other than, I think the only really early date that it gives is like 1000 BC for the beginning of the what does it call it? The Age of Britain, which I'd never heard of that. We'll get into that because there's some interesting stuff there. But yeah, so then it talks about Egypt and it talks about the New World, and it's like, oh well, that's kind of crazy, because you've got such a craze right now with, and I always forget his name. Who's the journalist who loves to talk about the ancient empire and Egypt and the pyramids and
Hancock,
right? I don't know why his name always escapes me. But yeah, I mean, that's a big thing now, right? Graham Hancock and all the people who kind of love his work and all the people who are kind of along with him, they're finding a lot of really convincing information. And that's what I presented before, is that it's like, if you're sophisticated enough to build the pyramids, like they're not some measly feat, you know, I mean, they're incredible. They're unbelievable works of engineering. If you can build a pyramid, you can build a boat to go around the world. You know what I mean? And so this is once again like really convincing to me, because it's like, oh, we have another record that kind of validates this kind of new wave of history. And I don't agree with everything Graham Hancock says, because I think that he's less scientifically rigorous than I would like to be, for sure. I think he says a lot of things that are like, that's just so speculative. The whole flood on the Sphinx and the pyramids. I don't believe in any of that. But I do believe that the Egyptians had a global empire. Right. And I said that pretty specifically. And I think I showed some incredibly convincing evidence. Like I would say, and I don't know if you remember, you know, how specific some of those things were, but I would say that it's irrefutable. Like at this point, the pre-Columbian transoceanic travel back to the Assyrian times, especially with that serpent. If you can remember how you had that in Levanta, Mesoamerica, we had that birdman, right? The eagle-headed birdman with the feline feet, and he's inside of the serpent, and he's holding the bag, right? And then you've got in Assyria the same thing, where you've got these anthropomorphic eagle-headed people holding a bag, and then you tie that together with the Egyptian motifs with the Happy's Cave that's shaped exactly the same way as that stele in Levanta. And then we talked about Izapa and how you had that tree, you know, with the kind of the goddess coming out of the tree, and the feline and the ibis birds, or I mean gods on either side, that match perfectly with reliefs that we see in Egypt. Like they're really convincing.
It was pretty crazy. Remind me though, I probably asked you this last time, but what do you make about the lack of interbreeding from like the genetic record or something? That's probably the first thing people would point to, like, there's no way, because we would be seeing all of this Middle Eastern genetics down in Mesoamerica or something.
So my thought is in two things. First, there's genetic haplogroup X2A, right? X2 or X in general. And it definitely shows some kind of transoceanic homogeny, although most geneticists place it very early, right? They're trying to say that this homogeny between the Middle East and North Africa that you see in haplogroup X, and it's
came through Asia or something.
Well, there is a pocket of it in Asia, but most of it matches with the Levant and Northern Africa. So it's more closely tied. Like if you just kind of Google X2A, you know, and you'll see maps where it really does match. So the argument isn't that it isn't a shared haplogroup, because it is. The argument is the date, is when they came over. And most people say, well, because the Kennewick man, dates to 7000 BC and he has X2A, then it must have come to America before, 7000 BC.
And the Kennewick man is?
That's a Native American burial that was found near Kennewick, Washington, that they did genetic testing to. And it was kind of, it was really a unique, there's a lot of controversy and because of an argument between who should get the remains and whether they should stay in a museum or whether they should be returned to Native Americans. They ended up being returned, but they did get genetic testing from it before that. My big
Okay, so
argument-
I pulled up a map of haplogroup X2A, and it is basically exactly as Lance is saying. There's a hot spot in the Levant. Weirdly enough, Ireland and northern. No, that's Iceland. Sorry, my maps. Iceland and northern England, and then over in the Americas, starting from Newfoundland, and then coming down to the Great Lakes region where that big copper culture was.
Is it in Mesoamerica too?
It's not in. There's a bunch of other smaller signs.
It's not really in Mesoamerica. It's mostly North America, and the Kolbrin, which we'll talk more about, that it's England. So its argument is that they're coming from England, probably across Iceland and Greenland, just like the Vikings did, way early.
Is that so the mainstream? That's the mainstream narrative, is that people were visiting in the first 10,000 years BC.
I think that the mainstream narrative is that must have come
across Beringia. Yep, across Bering Strait.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't make any goddamn sense. It's not it's not in Asia.
It does, but it doesn't. So their argument would be that the group there did not slowly travel and multiply as they went across Siberia. They just went quickly, so that they didn't leave any genetic imprint so much in Siberia or Asia or Alaska. They just came straight across.
Why are they so resistant to the idea that they came across Greenland area?
I think this boils down to what we talked about before, and it's just that it's really hard to buck the mainstream narrative. I think that there's a lot of people who are going against that narrative and making convincing arguments. And I think we'll see the scientific consensus overturn. I really think we do. We will.
Okay, so I can actually tell you why this is such a strong, why people don't like it. And they don't like it because the idea that there was a group that was from the Levant and then dispersed across the world and brought advanced culture and brought advanced art is foundationally removing the heritage of the people that are indigenous to those places. If you're like, look, the Mesoamericans started building pyramids because somebody from the Middle East came and taught them to build pyramids, it means that it's not something that is inherent to their own cultures. It's something that they learned from somebody else. And so this is viewed as being, like, foundationally, this is why people don't like Graham Hancock, because they're like, oh, that's white supremacy. That's saying that these cultures can't do it themselves. They have to be taught by somebody else. And there's another feature of this, which is a dispersion theory that was really popular for a while. So Thor Heyerdahl went to the Polynesian islands in the South Pacific, and he was kind of looking around and realizing that a ton of the plant species there were only found in South America. And then he went to South America and he realized that there was all these stories of the people who had come that were tall with red hair, and they had brought all of this technology with them, and then that they left to go across the ocean to the Polynesian islands. And the Polynesian islanders also have a myth of there being a culture that was there before they arrived, that they took a lot of stuff from. But Heyerdahl was also accused of, massive white supremacy. And so all of these theories just kind of, I think that they were just swept away from the popular narratives because of, some like postmodern desire for empowerment of indigenous cultures, which makes sense because after, 400 years of colonialism, you probably do want to do a thing or two in order to make up for the fact of like, oh, hey, sorry that we raped and murdered you for the last 500 years, maybe.
Just let them have their pyramids.
Exactly. I'm like,
maybe they won't revolt.
And their hieroglyphic writing. Yeah. And their motifs that look Egyptian. But yeah, there's some good arguments I think that can be made, because the same argument you end up seeing quite a bit online when it comes to the Mayan stuff, right? Because Mayan pyramids like at Copan and even Tikal, like when you compare them to some of the stuff that's in Indochina, like Cambodia and Indonesia specifically, like they're almost identical. And there's even elephant motifs within, two of the was it Copan? There's one of them in the Mayan lands where it's like they've got this elephant motif that is so Hindu looking. And everyone's like, well, what the heck's up with that? But it's like, well, once you compare the pyramids and you see all these correlations between, Indonesia and the Austronesian Empire and the Mayans, it's hard not to be like, yeah, they were coming over here for sure. And even, even who's the dominant Mesoamerican archaeologist from Yale? I just forgot. His wife was so into this diffusionary theory where you had people from the Austronesians coming over, and it's really being genetically proven now too.
We had this dude on the show. I don't know if it was since we talked last. I can't remember his name. Was it Lee Min? Was that the guy's name? Lee Min. He was an archaeologist from UC Davis who was over in China excavating this 2000. I think it was 2000 BC civilization, if I recall correctly. It was a really old one, but it's funny because they had these really Mesoamerican looking tiles just stuck randomly in their walls, and they were kind of upside down. Obviously, like they didn't really know what the hell they were. It seemed like they're really out of place and interesting, and he said they basically knew nothing about these people, and they were completely shocked to even find that there was a civilization there in the first place.
Yeah, and the point I wanted to make with that, going on with that, is the chicken and egg idea. Is that the debate is, did the Austronesians bring this stuff over to the Mayans, or did the Mayans bring it over to the Austronesians? And how can you prove it? So, and same with in most cases, we're probably going to side with the Asians and be like, well, Asia had so much trade between Africa and China and Europe, and the Middle East was the hub of all that, and that really gave them this advantage. And so it really was them that kind of like developed some of these technologies and then maybe spread them to America. But a good argument can be made that maybe some of these things originated in America. Like, it doesn't need to be a colonial supremacy issue in every case, because in a lot of cases it's like this could actually be a mark of pride for
I like
American,
that. That could sell it, I think, Lance.
Yeah.
That's
well, I think there's good evidence for that. There's entire groups, there's religious groups that are kind of based on that idea that it's like, no, a lot of this stuff was developed in the Americas and then actually diffused to other continents.
With the genetic stuff too, I'm always wondering if we have this history especially through our European ancestry in America, essentially in the United States. Like, we have this legacy of the Vikings, conquering and raping and pillaging their way through Europe, and so we always think that when one people meet another people that they're just gonna like impregnate everybody. But I wonder if that's not a cultural thing. Like, I wonder if that would like
they're just really chaste.
Not chaste, but I could imagine it being. I could imagine it being taboo to interbreed with.
No, for sure.
You know what I'm saying?
This is the point.
It doesn't have to be like, you could still be dominating them, but just be like, no, those people are gross. Like, we're not going to.
Everyone should remember this because it's played out really well in history. If you look up the genetic imprint of Romans in England, it's almost non-existent. Rome ruled England for almost 200 years. Right? I mean, they dominated England. They completely decimated, small parts of the population, put their overlords over them, built Hadrian's Wall to contain them, and yet left very little genetic imprint. So, and there was a lot of Romans, coming into there, relatively not a lot, but enough to rule. And so the idea that just because a group comes over and visits and trades, and that's going to leave a genetic imprint, it takes a lot to leave a genetic imprint, because when you think about how genetic diffusion happens with haplogroups, if I have two parents and one of them is like from one and one of them is from England, well, the first generation, I have 50% of that haplogroup. The second generation, I have 25%. The third generation, 12%. After that, 6%. It only takes like 8 generations and that's gone.
Yeah, I remember seeing an article recently that was, it was kind of like an argument. It was like, oh, you think you want to have kids because you want to preserve your genes, but after 10 generations, your genes are basically gone anyways. Like, they've been so diluted to the point that you may as well be a great, anybody, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think that the genetic argument is a good one at all. If anyone ever kind of points to genetics and be like, oh, well, those people didn't come over here, or those people didn't go over there because there's no genetics to prove it, saying, that's just a horrible argument. Don't use it. Let's look at the art. Let's look at the technology. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the dates. There's your evidence, and let's look at the histories. And so that takes us back to the Kolbrin, which maybe now we'll actually do do justice and give it a real introduction and kind of talk about what the Kolbrin is.
Let's talk about it, because like I said at the beginning, it's really hard to get anything other than it's just garbage off of Google from this.
Yeah.
And I saw that Wikipedia, people have tried to make Kolbrin pages many times on Wikipedia, but they keep getting taken down because the mainstream comes in and says it's just garbage and
Yeah.
we
And
can't have this on Wikipedia.
I think it's really unfortunate because my real first experience with it after I found it, and I think a lot of people's real only experience, for some reason, because it's ranked so high when you look it up, is you see that Rational Wikipedia. So the Rational Wiki has had an article on it for, I probably found it 15, almost 20 years ago. And that was the first result I got too, Rational Wiki. And it's been interesting to see the Rational Wiki article change over time. And it's always just been horrible. It's garbage. Like I'm going to just bash on Rational Wiki and say that this article is garbage. It's always been by people who did not ever read a word of the book. Like if you go to the Wayback Machine and read the thing from 15 years ago, and then compare it to the things I'm going to talk about, somebody wrote an article on it that hadn't even read a single word on it. It's just baloney. And so I think that that's disingenuous and intellectually completely dishonest for whoever those authors are of Rational Wiki, who decided to write an article based on one or two other people's hearsay without investigating it the teeniest bit themselves, because it was completely misleading. It was obvious they hadn't read it at all.
Well, it seems like nobody can get past the fact that there isn't an original manuscript. Like they don't have the tangible goods, essentially. And they're like, oh, this thing didn't surface till later, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
that's like, I think most people turn off at that point.
So that's kind of a pretty silly argument because we don't have the original of Manetho. But we believe it. Like, how about the, what is it? The Book of Sothis. Book of Sothis is like an 8th century forgery that claims to be ancient, but still from the 5th century, I think. And it's like, well, it is from the 5th century, and maybe the Kolbrin is from the 5th century. Like maybe it's putting together, maybe it was made up in the 5th century. That's fine. But to say that it was a 19th century fabrication, I'm going to just be really rude here and say only an idiot would say that. And
what do you make about the linguistic stuff, the linguistic arguments? People will point out that there's turns of phrase and so forth that really match closer to 19th, 20th century than to ancient times or something.
You're talking about like planetary orbits as being...
Yeah, like some of the celestial mechanics, just some turns of phrase just seem adapted to...
Well, and that's really one of the arguments I would say is when nobody's actually read it. Because this is why Rational Wiki decided to bash on it. And this is why a lot of people decided to bash on it. Okay, so I think it was probably the late 90s, maybe the early 2000s, this group of very unscientific, like, I don't even know what you want to call them, Planet Xers. I'm just going to call them Planet Xers. They found the manuscript, and then they created a publishing of it. So they published this thing called the Marshall Masters edition of the Kolbrin. And they're really the ones who popularized it. Because before that, there wasn't a published version of it that was on Amazon or anywhere that you could find it, right? And about that same time, the actual organization that this Marshall Masters group stole it from, like they published a version, but it was like $150. Like their version was hardbound, very difficult to find, hardly sold anywhere, incredibly expensive. But Marshall Masters, they published this version of it, and they put this sensationalized cover on it and this thing on the back that's like, this is a planet X, and it proves the planet Nerubu, and they get in all these talk forums and in all these online things, and they basically market it as something that supports their idea of planet X and Nerubu and this Babylonian idea, right? And so that's where it became popularized. And that, I agree with the Rational Wiki people, is just lame. It's dumb. First of all, because the book doesn't even talk about planet X, and we'll get into that in a second. But their interpretation of it did. And so because of the way they pushed it, the scientific community saw that and was like, oh yeah, this looks like hogwash. And they heard mostly podcasts by these Planet Xers talking about it. And then they based their opinion on those people's opinion, not on the actual text itself. And so I think that's where it got a bad rap. And that's where I would invite everybody to go, put aside the whole Marshall Master version, put aside, like even if you go on YouTube and you YouTube it, and look at, you'll see that half the YouTubes are like Planet X or garbage, because that has sunk so deep into the narrative. I just want to say, read the text itself. It doesn't talk at all about that. And there for sure might be some aspects of this text that are modern, for sure. It even says in it, like there's several of the books that are like, this was placed into the library late and we don't know its origin.
Got it.
Like, and one of the one that's the most speculative and the most deserving of criticism is a version in there that tells about the exodus of Moses from Egypt. right? And it's told from the Egyptian perspective. Now, if I'm ever reading a supposed ancient text and it starts talking about Jesus or Planet X or the Exodus or anything that we all know and we all really want an ancient thing of, then red flags pop up, right? Because it's like if someone's going to create a fabrication, if they're going to go to all this work to create some kind of an ancient fabrication, they pick those topics and they write these narratives to try and, validate their worldview. And that's what you expect from a fabrication. But what makes the Kolbrin so unique is that it has almost none of that. Like this text on Moses, which even says at the end of it, like this was a late edition, we don't know if it's legit. It's almost a side note. The majority of its history is like mundane, just completely boring stuff that no one would ever care about and makes absolutely no sense when you read it because it has no anchor to any kind of known history. Like when you find an ancient text in Egypt, that's usually what they are. They're just a compilation of like junk that no one wants to read about, right? I mean, we can talk about 3 or 4 different Egyptian texts that they found, hundreds of pages that no one ever wants to read because some of it might be like a magic spell book, which really usually the 90% of it is like some kind of magic spell type thing. And then there might be something in there about selling your sheep, or some administrative thing, or just, most writings are just completely uninteresting. And when it comes to the Kolbrin, like that's really how most of it is. It's like just kind of like this, like if you read the Avesta, and that's like the religious aspect, it's still the same way. Like you're trying to read, like it's hard. If you've ever gotten into the Avesta, or even any of those other...
I don't even know what that is.
It's the Zoroastrian kind of religious compilation. And it's big. There's a lot of books in there, but they're incredibly uninteresting. Unless you're Zoroastrian, I guess, But that is the Kolbrin. Like that's the Kolbrin. It's just so much stuff that it's like, oh, this is really... It's fascinating because it's kind of the best of these religious works, but it's still pretty uninteresting because it doesn't hinge on anything that we understand. Like there's so little in there that's really like giving a name of a pharaoh we might know, or even its allusion, its reference to David that I said. You would never guess it was David unless you like really knew the history and were like, oh wow, that's David.
So let's talk about, can we just pause and talk about what the heck this thing is? Like, where did it show up? What do people think it is? What do you think it is? What is it? We still haven't maybe brought us all into the fold of what the hell we're talking about.
Let's do a summary. So the best summary of understanding what it is, I mean, most people who want to answer that question just go to online and they find the Rational Wiki, and that's their first introduction to it. But the Marshall Masters edition doesn't even really give a great introduction, but it does have one. But the original has kind of a provenance of it. And so if you just go and you search for it online and you look for the archive.org version of it, there's a version on archive.org that has does it call it an introduction, or does it call it? Yes, it has a foreword and an introduction. And if you go to that forward introduction, it gives you kind of this history that says, what we know for sure of this book is that it has existed since about World War II, that the first printing that somebody who's doing this printing knew about was this guy in World War II. And he said it came from this, what is it called? Now I'm just forgetting. It's not Cadley, it's the Coldees. It came from this Coldees trust. Like basically and I wish I could even remember the wording, but kind of like an esoteric brotherhood where they just pass down records, right? And this is where you can actually validate this, because you can just go to Wikipedia, and if you look up Coldees, so Culdees, Coldees, there's a Wikipedia entry for Coldees, right? And Coldees is just like an Irish term for these monastic orders. And these monastic orders were really popular during the medieval period, right? So from like 700 to 1200 AD, there were a lot of these Coldees groups, which were basically just kind of like monastic library monks, that kept records. And they had all sorts of records in them. So it's saying that there was one of these groups that had a bunch of records. And then it gives a little bit of a history that says that when, I think maybe it was the Herring of the North, after the Norman invasion in 1050 AD, that a lot of those were destroyed, right? Because Christianity, kind of a different brand of Christianity, was brought with the Normans, and they were fanatical about their brand of it. So they burned tons of monasteries and tons of these monastic orders and anyone who wasn't like theirs was anyone who had a history that seemed pagan. It was thrown out. And that was probably the second or third time that happened. It probably happened in the second and fourth centuries as well with small groups. So anyway, so this thing is supposedly coming from one of these Chaldees monastic orders. And so then I can picture in my mind, especially since we have a lot of history, English history that tells about these Chaldees trusts, that these probably did exist. Like this is this is a rational explanation that there were compilations of lots of early manuscripts that were passed down all the way to medieval times and then all the way to World War II, and that somebody just had a compilation, a mismatch of like their sacred books. Now, where the Kolbrin comes in is the Kolbrin is actually, this is where some kind of mistaken ideas come in, because Kolbrin is actually a word that just means books. So in Welsh, I believe it is, I can't remember what the word, but it's like Kolbrin, just means books. And so there's some things in there that says that, well, some of these ideas came from the Druids. And who are the Druids? They were just the pagans they were the non-Christian, which anything that was non-Christian was pagan. So these were religious traditions that predate Christianity in Britain. And that there were some of these Druid orders that existed all the way through Christian times, but they had to be hidden because otherwise they'd be destroyed, right? And they had some books that they called Kolbrin too. And so this book, the Kolbrin, was kind of named after that Druidish idea that it's like we call our religious book Kolbrin, which is actually spelled with a C, even though the modern Kolbrin, it's been changed to a K, Kolbrin instead of Coel, Kolbrin.
Are there any Druidic writings, though? I was under the impression they were exclusively an oral tradition society.
Well, according to the Kolbrin, yes. The Kolbrin would say that this is a huge part of what the Druids were all about. And it's basically a compilation of, so the very first major text in the Kolbrin is pretty obviously an expanded version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And the Epic of Gilgamesh has, I can't remember what, 3 major versions and fragments of 12 others or something. Someone will have to look that up. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but there's a lot of versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and some are more compact and some are more expanded. So this one has completely different names. It's called like the Book of Hermitur. And I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know how you would know how to pronounce it exactly. But as you go through the characters, it's like, well, this is pretty obviously the Epic of Gilgamesh. But once again, it's not told at all in a way where somebody is like taking the Epic of Gilgamesh and just like copying it so that it's obvious that it's like, well, yeah, this is it, and I'm expanding it, and I've got it. Instead, it's like, no, this is like, once again, you just have to read it to see what you think of it. Like when you read it to begin with, I'd never read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I definitely didn't think like, oh yeah, this is the Epic of Gilgamesh. But there's somebody who's like, whoa, look at all these correlations. And notice the way that the other versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh we have, notice the way that the variations exist. And notice how this variation is kind of similar to how the other variations are. That this was an oral tradition told in the Middle East from very ancient times, at least 2000, maybe, who knows, maybe 4000 BC, but at least 2000 BC. This is first getting written down from these oral traditions. And now we have another version of it preserved in this compilation of ancient British records. Right. And it's not even so much Egyptian, this one, as it is probably Mesopotamian.
And so I guess the surprising thing in this is just the degree of dispersion of these stories, because you wouldn't expect there to be some obscure Celtic sect that is telling even a version of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
You might think that, but the parts of the history that it does give in the Kolbrin are of a lot of voyagers from the Middle East. And all of the names, every single name in the Kolbrin is a strange name. Like I have an article on this, and I try and correlate the Pharaohs and just like we're talking about with Gilgamesh, none of them correlate with what you see in history. Like it's obvious these are coming through a different language tradition where they are not translating them phonetically in a way that we catch them. I mean, sometimes maybe they're somewhat similar, but they're always different. The names are, right? But the stories are similar. And it's like, well, why is that? Well, if these people are coming from the Middle East and it gives descriptions of where they're coming from, even though we don't really understand a lot of the names, the descriptions are like very clearly, these are Near Eastern, Greek, Phoenician, Egyptian, even a group from the Levant, from the northern Levant. So these are Middle Eastern people who are inhabiting Britain. And is that like something we wouldn't expect? Like, no, we know that they were coming to Britain because we had the tin mines all the way from Phoenician times. Certainly from...
There's a fair amount of semantic overlap too, from what I understand. There's a cool Wikipedia page that compares Gaelic and ancient Hebrew and finds a ton of congruences between certain common words. And there's, I think, actually a fairly academic argument that the Phoenicians were doing things up there. I didn't know about the tin mines, but I bet that fits right in.
Yeah. I mean, there were definitely Assyrian age tin mines for sure. And when I just kind of, I mean, this is a Graham Hancock thing again. When you look at the fact that the Great Pyramids, are built like 2400 BC, and then we have not only Stonehenge, but also the Scottish. Well, how did I just forget? What's the Stonehenge of Ireland? Let me look it up.
Sorry, I don't even know there was one.
I'm out of my depth here.
Let me look.
I mean, I think those circles are pretty common, honestly. A lot of them were wood, though. But
I can't believe I can't remember it. Anyway, any Irish person is screaming in their mind like they know what it is. But they've got two or three.
Founded back west.
Newgrange, that's what it is. Okay, yeah, if you look up Newgrange, Newgrange is awesome, right? And I mean, it dates to like 2000 BC as well. So at the same time that we've got the Egyptians building these unbelievable monuments, we've got people in Britain building these unbelievable monuments. Stonehenge is incredibly impressive. Like it's unreal. It's great. It's not pyramids level, but it's pretty amazing. So once again, this is just more evidence that I think that you had kind of like a multicultural empire under the Egyptians, where they are sailing far and wide. And if you remember my last thing where I talked about how that the Caracol in southern in Peru and South America also dates to the same age as the pyramids.
And so basically, like, there's some kind of stone building ethos or motivation that's being distributed from the Middle East, and all of these different pieces are demonstrating the fact that this isn't just people that along independent lineages have suddenly decided to start building things out of stone. It's the fact that there's actually true cultural dispersion that's happening, and that you can start to see pieces of this not just in the stone, but also in the fact that what the hell is the Epic of Gilgamesh doing in northern England?
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And if we see stone technology that looks similar, that's going from the Phoenicians to Sardinia to Spain, southern Spain has tons of these huge megalithic things that date to that same 2000, 3000 years BC. And then we start seeing in England, why not have records? Is it so hard to believe? Rational Wiki people. Is it so hard to like kind of climb off our high horses and be like, I don't know, maybe that's possible. Let's read it.
Well, it's really interesting because I think that if you look at for example, when we were talking about Shimao, which Lee Min at UCLA is talking about these very, very Mesoamerican looking features in these blocks. And what's interesting is that they're not, the stone walls are not assembled out of them. The stone walls are assembled out of regular blocks, and then occasionally they'll have other blocks that have Mesoamerican motifs in them that are just kind of haphazardly put into the walls.
They're like upside down sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's clear that they took other stones and then they built the walls of the city that's like 2000 BC out of blocks that happen to have Mesoamerican imagery on them. And he's like, well, the anthropological explanation for this is from Claude Lévi-Strauss, where there's just some sort of collective unconscious, and maybe people are doing the same drugs, and they're seeing...
he said mushrooms. He was like, oh, when you eat mushrooms, you see the same things. I was like, you've never eaten mushrooms, have you?
He was also like, yeah, we found this weird vessel that was shaped in this strange way, and one of my students was like, Professor, that's a bong. And he was like, oh, yeah, that I think it was. And so they're taking drugs and they're seeing these things. And when they see the, seventh dimensional Mesoamerican demon or whatever, they just happen to make the same shapes. And
put it in the wall upside down.
But I think that what it points to is that you see this all over the place, where Shiloh and I have been thinking, this is tangential, but we've been thinking a lot about physics because we're working on this book. And there's like weird features of physics that you find where it's like mathematically complete. It's an accurate representation of the world. And yet you're like, well, why does it look that way? There's no real explanation. And I think that that's always the sign that you find in the world where somebody has acknowledged that it looks this way. And then when you start to ask questions about, well, what is the motivating feature that produces that? You find nothing underneath that. That's when you know that there's something still to be discovered. And I think that building with megalithic blocks is kind of one of those things where it's a pretty labor-intensive and strange thing to just decide to do one day. It makes a lot more sense if somebody shows up and says, okay, well, if you build with these megalithic blocks, then you get something else, whether it's power or influence. Yeah, you build an antenna to communicate with alien civilizations, like who knows?
Right. And we get into that Graham Hancock stuff and everybody thinking that they played noises to levitate them. And who knows? None of that is scientifically provable, but maybe not disprovable either. I don't really buy it, but I totally agree that there probably is some religious aspect, right? There probably is, like, that's what this cultural diffusion is. Like, they're probably not just bringing the technology, and maybe even the elephants that are helping move them. We have some illustrations in ancient Egypt where they're using elephants to help move stuff, but they're bringing the technology and maybe work animals to do it, but also probably some kind of religious system. And Stonehenge is a great example of that.
Because I mean, like Shiloh and I went to Mycena in ancient Greece, and it's this ancient city built out of megalithic blocks. Nobody knows who built it. Like, if you look at the placards, they're like, well, Homer says the Cyclopeans built it. And it's like, who are the Cyclopeans? Well, they're fictional characters in his epics. Because it's just, by the time that he was telling the stories, trying to explain who could have possibly motivated people to assemble these huge blocks, the understanding of who built Mycena was already lost. It was like, almost a millennium later. And so I get the feeling that when you look at those cities, there's nothing except for some kind of strong religious system, some kind of belief system that could motivate people to do that, because there's plenty of land. Like, you can farm, you can grow your olives and your citrus or whatever it is that you're doing. There's nothing that motivates you to do that unless somebody is telling you that if you do it, you're going to get some kind of benefit. So it does seem to have some element of a structured social process that's being introduced.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the Greek annals, that just makes me think of what we were just barely talking about. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Who brought stuff where? The Americans to Asia, or the Asians to America? Let's remember that in Plato, right? And I think Graham Hancock mentions this. He says that the Atlanteans, who lived out beyond the Pillars of Hercules, came and conquered this entire land, including conquering Greece and into Egypt. And he gives a date for when that conquering happens. And it's like right around the time of the Younger Dryas at 9000 BC, which sounds bonkers, right? I mean, I don't really blame an archaeologist or a historian to be like, well, that just sounds bonkers. But as these things become more widespread and more people understand and see the absolutely, I think, undeniable evidence of trans-oceanic pre-Columbian travel, I hope that maybe we'll open our mind to those possibilities. That it's like, maybe there were empires. Like I say, I absolutely believe that Egypt had a global trade organization. And did something happen 10,000 BC where there was kind of a global trade organization? Were the Atlanteans Americans? Like, Poverty Point sure it looks a lot like what he describes, right? He describes this circular city. Like, look at Poverty Point. It's laid out exactly in the way that he's describing. It's beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Were they coming over way back then? Who knows? Until we see evidence that's that old, maybe we won't believe it, but let's not disbelieve it either. Let's leave that as an open door to be like, we'll see. Well, maybe that's where X came from. Maybe haplogroup X is from the Atlanteans when there was some kind of a trans-oceanic. Maybe what is the hypothesis of the Neolithic pottery and shards that they see that ends up getting passed around? The Soltrian hypothesis, right? Where there are some people who find some evidence and it's been widely dismissed. But it's like, we should probably revisit that and at least keep our minds open to
what
the
is
possibility.
this? I don't know this.
So there's lots and lots of articles on the Soltrian hypothesis, and that is just a hypothesis where there are shared traits, especially in shards and projectiles. I can't remember whether they later find some pottery that they're trying to tie it to, but for sure, like some Neolithic evidence of a civilization that maybe spanned both North America and Europe.
That's crazy.
And they're probably basing that largely too on Plato's words, because we've got evidence in the historical record where it's like there's some kind of empire that was coming over. who knows? There's a lot we don't know, and I think that's what I like to push this point. Is like let's not dismiss things, let's not bash them, especially this Kolbrin. Go read it. I really love getting in there and reading about. I mean, I think it mentions over 8 pharaohs, Egyptian pharaohs, and trying to correlate them with actual people, and it's really difficult. Like none of their names are exact, but there's one that it calls Naba. Oh, how do you pronounce it? Nabakian? Nabahantan. So Nabahantan is obviously Akhenaten. That's another one that, like the King David, whereas the King David is like one verse, essentially, maybe 2 sentences, maybe 3 that are like describing King David. This story of Nabahantan, it is like a full chapter, maybe even, I can't remember, 3 chapters, where it is very obviously talking about Akhenaten. And it talks about him having I think that he has a child with his daughter, if I remember right. But there's some kind of incestual relationship in there that when I first read it, I'm like, never heard of that. But then you go look it up online, and now DNA, like they're actually proving that through DNA, and that's just been in the last 30 years. So here we have the Kolbrin actually giving us some detail that we don't find in historical sources elsewhere that now is being proven through DNA. So once again, why on earth would you dismiss that and say, oh, this was just written at World War II? You know, look into these things, like check them out, because it's really fascinating. And we get more information to help us create a revised Egyptian chronology, you know, like I've done. It's great. It's awesome. The more information, the better.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah, you. Yeah, I was talking to you. So if you're listening to this podcast and you are enjoying it, I think you should consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci, because we want to make sure that this project never has sponsorships, never has advertisements, and is always powered by our audience. We can only do that if you come support us over at patreon.com/DemystifySci. For just 75 cents a week, you can make sure that you contribute to powering this project for the future. We have a bunch of different dates floating around, right? So you're like, Plato writes about the Atlanteans that are beyond the gates of Hercules, and he points to that being, you said, like 9,000 BC. But then you're like, maybe it's something in the Americas, but the conventional date for the Americas is like the earliest mound building cultures are like 4,000 BC. And then there's the Phoenicians that are in northern England, but I don't really know what dates those are. And so like there's a bunch of these different pieces that are floating around, and I don't have a scaffold to put them onto yet. And it sounds like this king list that you've been working on is the scaffold. And so maybe we can use that as the scaffold and then zoom it out to a bigger picture of the ancient world.
Very well put.
I do my best. Why can't I hear that?
Okay. You want to start right now?
Yes.
Okay.
we can start later.
Should we take another break?
We better take another break. No. Okay. All right. So as far as a timeline, I have kind of 2 separate timelines for history in my mind, right? So my first timeline is the one that I am fairly certain of and is more scientifically based and is my revised Egyptian chronology, right? And Manetho's chronology only starts at about, 2600 BC, 3000 BC, that region, right? And it kind of depends on what you do as your intermediate periods. But typically Egyptian history only starts then, right? And like the first, after Namer, the first pharaoh, a lot of the early chronologists have like the first pharaohs living like a long period of time, which is the same with the Greek guy, and the biblical guys are all living 1,000 years. So we don't really even believe those first people on the chronology. But for me, like kind of concrete history in that timeline starts with Amos and David. Like that's where I put a history where it's like, I feel really confident about this. And even though the Kolbrin is what put me onto this, the more that I compare it to Herodotus, compare it to history, I have this spreadsheet, and I mean, if we had shared screen, I could show you that. This just massive spreadsheet that has the entire chronology on a Google spreadsheet with like every king list from a stela or from a monument put side by side with that, with Herodotus put side by side with that, with all of the history and correlations that I find to the side of that. And I mean, what I find I'm pretty confident in. Like, it just seems like and I talked about this before, how the radiocarbon dating for Egypt is totally misleading, right? Because when you have the Hallstatt Plateau that we talked about, where, in the early Iron Age, from about 400 BC to 700 BC, there's real problems with the carbon dates, and I kind of show how that they made them go off one direction in their correlation curve, and I think that they should go off the other direction. But my confident history, though, is that Amos of the 19th dynasty matches with King David, right? He lived in the time of King David, which
I think you
means
said
that
18th dynasty earlier.
yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I was getting that right. Right, 18th dynasty. And so what that makes, right, is that makes it so that the Hyksos are actually the Amalekites, which is another thing that the Kolbrin actually mentions. It talks about the Amalekites coming into Egypt and taking over. So in other words, they are this powerful Levantine empire that conquers Egypt.
How do they relate to King David?
And then Saul and King David conquered them. Right. And so where Josephus is saying like, oh, the Hyksos are Moses, it's like, no. That's ridiculous, because they conquer Egypt. Right. Moses doesn't conquer Egypt. Like, this is a warlike people that the archaeology says comes into the Delta region and creates a city right there at I just forgot what the city is, Avaris, right? It founds a capital at Avaris. And one of the really interesting things is at Avaris, they find like all of this cache of chopped off hands, right? And like thousands of sacrificed bulls and stuff, like things that's like basically right out of the Bible. It's not in the time of Moses in the Bible that we hear like of the Israelites chopping everyone's hands off, right? And sacrificing thousands of bulls. It's like, no, that's during King David. And so it says that King David conquers these Amalekites, who are a very powerful people, and then conquers all the way to the Delta. And yet here we find in the archaeology a people, the Hyksos, that conquered all the way into the Delta and founded a capital down there at Avaris, right on one of the branches of the Nile. It's like it fits perfectly.
So King David cleaned up the conquering that they already did. He just took possession of their land.
He just took possession of it, yeah, and then it fell apart after he did that. Right.
Who are these people, by the way? Can you explain where they came from, or
like are the
the Amalekites?
Are the Amalekites a biblical?
They're biblical people.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's so ugly when you get into archaeology, because all the archaeological people are named after biblical people. But then it's like, well, did they get it right? And in most cases, I say, no, they didn't get it right. And it's almost funny, right? Because the Hyksos are being used to prove David by the religionists, but then now it's actually going to disprove the Bible. It's like now people, because the people tried to prove the Bible and got it wrong, now everyone disbelieves the Bible because they got it wrong. They use the Bible to create archaeology, but then archaeology shows that their correlation is not true, and so now the Bible is disbelieved.
And so, are there an archaeological people that are the Amalekites, or do they still?
I think it's the Edomites. I think it's the Edom from Edom.
Well, what I'm saying is that the Hyksos are the archaeological people. I'm saying that the Hyksos are both the Amalekites and David. That you see them as one archaeological unit. And let me see what dynasty that is. I think that is the 16th, the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties are Hyksos dynasties ruling from Avaris. And so I say
avarice, like greed.
What's that?
Like avarice.
That's the name of the city.
The name of the city is Avaris, like greed.
Yeah.
What a name!
I wonder if it is related to that. Yeah, it's probably a Greek name. But yeah, Avaris is an archaeological ruins on the easternmost fork of the Delta of the Nile River Delta.
Okay, and so who are these Edomites that you just mentioned?
Yeah, Edom was one of the principal states in ancient Canaan, or in that period, from what I recall. I'd have to go look it up though. Give me a second.
Yeah, and I think they were over toward the Babylonian region more. But let's look really quick. Everyone, if you look up the Amalekites on Wikipedia, it'll probably give you two. Maybe it's the same article, or maybe it's different articles, because you've got an archaeological people and a biblical people. Let's see. Am I?
Yeah, Edom's kind of like down below. What's that sea that Jericho is on? big one. God, I'm terrible at this. Yeah, like Edom's kind of bordering Egypt down in the southern part of the Levant.
I've lost the thread.
Well, we're just trying to understand who the archaeologists point to are the Edomites, because Lance is replacing them with the Hyksos.
So I'm replacing the people of Amalek in the Bible with the Hyksos, and this is totally different from what most kind of religious revisionists do, because most, including starting with Josephus, most revisionist religionist people are trying to find a correlation, say that the Hyksos have something to do with Moses and the children of Egypt. The children of Israel in Egypt. I say no, absolutely not. There are warlike Asiatic people who are found in the archaeology, right, that conquer Egypt, not the Israelites of Moses. They are the enemies of Israel until David conquers them, right? And so it's kind of confusing in that way, right? Because in the Bible, there are two different people. We've got the people of Amalek, and then we've got David who conquers them, right? And then in the archaeology, we only have one people, the Hyksos. So in the archaeology, it's hard to tell the difference between a people and a people who conquer a people, right? Because if they've got the same wares, the same pottery, they kind of share a similar civilization, and then they conquer each other, you don't really see a big difference in the archaeology. So I am saying
it's more like a political party at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So
these guys go all the way back, though. I just want to say, like, it looks like they're mentioned. The Hyksos are mentioned all the way back into the 6th dynasty of Egypt, 2300 BC.
Yeah, and part of the reason why is because Hyksos is kind of like, sometimes it's translated as shepherd kings, and there's a number of different translations for it. But basically, it's just what the Egyptians called Canaanite invaders. Right? So there's even a reference to Hyksos, if I remember right, when the Persians come in and conquer Egypt, because that's just their name for like Asiatics, Asiatic invaders. Sometimes that's what they translate it as, Asiatics instead of shepherd kings. So you shouldn't get hung up too much on the name. But the main Hyksos dynasties, right, are those ones that I talked about, like 17th, 18th, 19th dynasty. And then it's Amos that frees Egypt, that retakes Egypt again from these Asiatic invaders.
Wait, it can't, hold on. It can't be 17th, 18th, and 19th, because you said that the Amos was 18th.
Okay.
And so it had to be later.
Yeah. Sorry, let me.
On for dear life
the 15th, 16th, and 17th.
Okay, and so
15th,
there's
16th to 17th. The 18th is Amos. The 18th is the New Kingdom. The 18th is where the Valley of the Kings and all the big names in Egyptian history really start.
So the Hyksos come before that.
Yes.
Okay, and so if the Hyksos come before that, and then like bring the story of King David in, because like my understanding of this history is basically nil. Like the Israelites are supposed to be in Egypt. In the timeline of this chronology of kings, what dynasty are they in Egypt at?
So they're in Egypt after Joseph to Moses, from Joseph to Moses. So that's like, around 1500 BC, they're in Egypt.
And so what number dynasty is that?
So that would be in our timeline, a dynasty that I don't even know, but way early. Like a lot of people try and correlate with that, with the 3rd, the 4th, probably the 4th dynasty when they're actually building the pyramids. Who knows?
Okay, so this is like well before the Hyksos show up.
Yeah, I don't offer opinion on that because the Kolbrin doesn't say anything about it. I haven't found any correlation strong enough to be like, wow, this is legit. But when my correlation starts, it's like, well, this really is a very strong correlation, is with the end of the Hyksos, right? So once we get to that 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasty, right, specifically like the 15th dynasty, and it's interesting that a lot of the reigns of these pharaohs of the 15th dynasty are 40-year periods, which is the same as what the Bible says for Saul, David, and Solomon, that they all had these 40-year reigns, right? So, and there's a lot of interesting correlations with their names, like Apophis, and how you find that, reflected in Israelite archaeology. So, and this is really the big contribution that I'd like to make, that I like people to kind of consider, is the idea that the Hyksos are the Amalekites and then King David. And that Avaris is the capital that David took, that Saul and David, conquered in Egypt and that they ruled from. And that then Amos conquered David, which is what the Kolbrin says, right? So Amos conquers David and drives him out of Egypt. Or it's probably Solomon who actually gets driven out, because that's what the Bible says, it's Solomon and his sons that then kind of the empire collapses. So
Okay.
that's a major revision, and it's a very, very different. But I think that puts it on solid archaeological basis that it can't be quite so quickly dismissed. Whereas when you try and make the Hyksos into like Moses or something like that, you can very quickly dismiss that. It doesn't fit. It's kind of silly.
Because it's too early.
Yeah, it's too early, and the archaeology doesn't match the biblical account at all. Because Moses is supposed to be like, the people of Israel are slaves. They're not conquerors. And they'd been there for a long time, for like hundreds of years as slaves, for at least 200 years. But yet the Hyksos are like coming in at that period and conquering Israel at that period, during this late Hyksos period. And then Egypt conquers them and drives them out. No, this is not Moses. This is exactly what happened in the days of David, Solomon, and Jeroboam.
Okay, so the Hyksos take over Egypt, you say, in the 15th dynasty, and they maintain control through the 17th dynasty.
Yeah.
18th dynasty is the New Kingdom, where we see this, like, the Valley of the Kings and all of these, like, massive works. At what point in this chronology do you think that David would come in to take over?
So the takeover in my chronology would be right at about, well, okay, are you talking about David's takeover of Egypt, or Egypt's retaking over of the Hyksos strongholds?
No, so this is the thing
Hyksos are thrown out at that point.
At which point?
When Amos comes
Yeah,
to
with Amos. Amos conquers them.
Yes, so Amos, but
so all this stuff with the biblical people is before all that, right?
Well, that's what I'm confused about, because if the Hyksos are in control of Egypt, 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties, and David is conquering the Hyksos, then he has to be somewhere in there in the 15th, 16th, or 17th dynasty, right?
Right.
Okay, so does Amos take the kingdom back from David or from the Hyksos?
Amos takes it over from David, Solomon.
Okay.
From Solomon and Solomon's son, is mostly Jeroboam.
I see. Okay, so how long do you think that the Hyksos ruled Egypt for? Like, how many of these dynasties? Because you're basically giving this like period of 15th, 16th, and 17th as being the Hyksos. But if it's because it was David, you said Saul, David, Solomon, and then by the time that Jeroboam and Rehoboam, are the two sons, they divide the kingdom, and so but Saul's not a conqueror. It's David that conquers.
Saul starts it and David finishes it.
But so that can only be like
in the glory of it.
But that's only like a century of time, like 120 years.
Yeah, and when you look at the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasty, like that only covers about a 70-year period. Those three dynasties cover like 100 years.
It's like Bush 1 and Bush 2.
But so like the Hyksos are in control for like a split second.
Yeah, like 200 years. So Hyksos existed all the way like into, like you were kind of mentioning, there's mention of Hyksos into far earlier dynasties. But the Hyksos, so let me give you actual dates. And on my spreadsheet, you can actually see every date. And I mean, if I shared my screen, then it'd probably make a lot more sense. You could see, but maybe that'd be too big of a pain. But basically, so this is the timeline. So at 1500 BC, you've got Moses and the Israelites leaving Egypt. Okay. Somewhere about, and that's in the Kolbrin. The Kolbrin kind of talks about it. Maybe that part's fabricated. I don't know. You can read it yourself. Then maybe you have a huge, an intermediate period where you have a huge collapse of civilization right at that point, right at 1500 BC. Okay. Somewhere in the next about 200 years, the people of Canaan, these Amorites and Amalekites, conquer Egypt. So then Egypt gets conquered after Moses leaves. And who conquers Egypt? The Hyksos, right? And they rule loosely for, 250, 300 years, but tightly, well, it probably is like at least 250 years that they rule Egypt. But then David and Solomon, right? Saul, David, they conquer the Hyksos. And then you could say are actually become the Hyksos because they conquer these Amorite, Amalekite people. And now they rule Egypt, but they only rule for about 80 years. So they are those last Hyksos rulers that we see in the archaeology, which is the 15th dynasty. Right?
Okay,
and so archaeologically, they're dated. They date those dynasties to like 1600 to 1500 BC. I say, no, that's wrong. it's actually 1,000. It's actually 1,100 to 1,000 BC. We're off by almost 500 years in our chronology. So my revised chronology moves that by 500 years. And we talked about that before and how I kind of use my carbon dating to show that it's like, this is actually believable given the radiocarbon dating too.
And the
But I say the
Hallstatt Plateau, for anybody that doesn't remember, is basically this anomalous period. You said it was between 400 BC and 700 BC, where like normally radiocarbon dates have this consistent slope to them, but there's something that happens between that period where basically the slope flattens. And so instead of having a
Like
correlation,
carbon's not decaying on time.
yeah, like what does that represent?
The most given explanation, right, usually has to do with the sun's intensity. Because radiocarbon is created from nitrogen, right? So nitrogen is kind of hit by high energy particles from the sun. So if you have kind of a more energetic sun for some period of time, then it will end up creating, false readings on the radiocarbon dates. So solar output is probably the biggest explanation for why we have wiggles in our correlation curve, right? And the IntCal correlation curve, which you can kind of get online and kind of see how they do that. They're basically taking the existing curve and then comparing it to history and using a lot of these dynastic kings of Egypt to do it. And so they're creating a correlation curve where they say, hey, well, look, from Manetho, we get that these Hyksos lived at 1500 BC. That's what our chronology says that for Manetho. And so we radiocarbon dated something, and it actually says that it's 1300 BC. Right. And I have an article on this. You can check it on this. So the radiocarbon dating uncorrelated is off by 250 years. And they say, well, so let's create our correlation curve. And let's say that even though it dates to 1250, we're going to say it actually happened at 1500 BC. And so we're going to correlate it by moving it 250 years this direction. I say, whoa, you did wrong here. You should have moved it 250 years the other direction, because your Manetho chronology is wrong, right? As kind of shown by the Kolbrin. And so you correlated it 250 years in one direction. You should have actually correlated it 250 years in the other direction, right? But either way, the radiocarbon date is not spot on. The radiocarbon date is giving us a problem. And we know that it gives us problems because the problems are so big during the Hallstatt Plateau that the dates are all over the place, right? There's these crazy spikes. There was probably some kind of solar flares or solar max going on, that was corrupting the dates. You can speculate on the different reasons on why they get corrupted, but this is scientifically viable. So, and that's something I want people to hit too, is like, don't ever look at the radiocarbon dates when it comes to ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia and be like, well, they say one thing, and so this revised chronology must be wrong. It's like, no, look into it. I have a sheet that has every single radiocarbon date and the actual date it gives and the correlated date. You'll see they're all off. Don't use that. That shouldn't be your evidence. Go for better historical evidence. Go for interesting correlations. Go and see if you can solve the Amasis problem, which is like in Herodotus, when you get late in the chronology, it repeats. It does this weird repeat thing with Pharaoh Amasis, where there's a big jump. And I don't even know if we're going to be able to get to this, but I have an article where you can kind of really read how there gets to be this issue late in Herodotus, especially, and definitely in Manetho. And so I just encourage people like let this be an open issue, because it's not solved. I remember when I first confronted it, it kind of felt like, oh, this is solved. And look, there's these articles that say the radiocarbon dates validate the historical dates. And so it's almost like, oh, well, I guess we shouldn't work on that problem because it's been solved. And then I looked into it deeper and it was like, whoa. There's a lot of talking heads here that haven't looked into it enough. This is wrong. First of all, the radiocarbon dates do not prove it. They're all off by 250 years. So they all correlate them. So when you say that they vindicate, and when you see some of these headlines, some of these articles on even a Science magazine that says like they vindicate it, then you get into the data and it's like, well, that's a lie. You're misleading people. They don't vindicate it. They say right there in the paper. And, I have references to all the papers and my articles that I give on this. They're off by 250 years. And I'm saying they're off by 250 years. They've correlated them in the wrong direction. Anyway, so let's get back really
definitely
quick.
Send us those articles and we'll put them in the description. And honestly, if you could post your spreadsheets somewhere that people could check it out, that would be
okay. Yeah, I totally will. I think it's already public, and so I'll
we'll link it.
Give a link to it as well. So then, right? So then we have the Hyksos are the Amorites, Amalekites, these people who lived in the Levant. So then at 1,000, and instead of dating to 1500 BC, like most archaeologists say, they actually date to 1,000 BC. David conquers them. He rules from avarice for a little bit, almost kicks him out. And then we have this dual dynastic period, right? Because the 18th dynasty is kind of like the height, you could say, from a lot of people, of Egyptian glory. So this is when the Valley of the Tombs is happening and all the kings are being buried in these massive tombs. So these major rulers, right, like Amenhotep, Tutmos, Amenhotep, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, right, all these guys with their amazing tombs, these are actually contemporaries to the dynastic period in Israel, which actually ends up making a lot of sense, right? Because if right now they date them as being like 500 years before the dynastic period of Israel. But when you put them with the dynastic period of Israel, you're like, oh, when you're reading the Bible and you're reading about Amos, all the big kings that exist there, you know, when you read it, it sounds a lot like when you read the dynastic kings of Egypt. And not only that, when it talks about them being buried in this manger tomb system that supposedly is somewhere hidden in Israel even to this day, it's like, whoa, that creates a whole nother picture in our minds. If the 18th dynasty of Egypt is contemporary to the dynastic king period of Israel and Judah, that's a whole nother paradigm in our mind. And it also opens up a whole nother like can of worms, because there's things like the Amarna letters, right, which are famous. These famous set of letters that exist between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and all these different, you know, the Lydians, I think, are on one side of them. They're writing letters. The Pharaoh of Egypt is writing letters to all these people in Mesopotamia and Levant. And right now they think, oh, this dates to like 1200 BC. So it doesn't really correlate at all with the Bible, because it's in that weird Judges period of the Bible where it's kind of like a black hole. But once you like do this correlation, it's like, whoa, okay, this is actually during the Assyrian period. And these armies that the Amarna letters are talking about that are attacking are actually Assyrians. And a lot of the letters then start to make a lot more sense. And we don't have a repeating history anymore, because right now the Amarna letters are happening at 1200 BC. And then the exact same events happen when the Assyrians start attacking everywhere, including fighting with the northern Egyptian kingdom. Then history kind of repeats. And it's like, whoa, this is kind of crazy. And maybe one of the biggest ones of all of them, I mean, it moves when the Bronze Age collapses. It actually makes it so the Bronze Age collapse, which is kind of debated whether it's like a natural disaster or whether it's a massive army that's going through and just killing everybody, or whether it's a combination of both. But in this case, under my correlated timeline, the Bronze Age collapse would be the Assyrians coming through and just killing everybody.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, there definitely was the volcano. What was it, Santorini, that exploded somewhere around that time too. The Minoans lost their preeminence in the Mediterranean around that point. It's a really important and obscure moment in history.
So, in your timeline, do you shift the moment of the Bronze Age collapse then for everybody?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you change the events that are ascribed to the Bronze Age collapse?
Honestly, it kind of makes a little bit of sense to me on its face, because one thing that's really bizarre is that if Santorini was the trigger for the Bronze Age collapse, the height of Minoan civilization is actually a few hundred, I think 250 years after the Santorini explosion.
250 years.
Yeah, something like that. I'd have to look it up, but it is afterwards, and it's one of those points, just like with the physics or something, where you read it and everybody's just like, yeah, okay, but it doesn't really make any sense at all.
I actually remember us talking about this, and you were telling me about it, and I was kind of like, well, why? How's that possible if they died from the volcano? It seems weird that they would have a golden age of their civilization after they were supposed to be wiped out.
It's really, really weird.
So yeah, my question was, do you change the events that are ascribed to the Bronze Age collapse, or do you simply shift the date when it happens?
So I think this is where it gets kind of confusing. And my this is pretty radical. Like I said, this is radical. This is the type of thing
Lance, we would expect no less of you.
For sure, radical. But so in my view, as I look at the Bronze Age collapse, there's lots of people, so much study on that. I mean, hundreds of research papers, and they all attack it from different angles. So if they're attacking it from an archaeological angle, and they're saying, okay, well, this archaeological, like for instance, let's say they have a town, and that town, you know, is tied strongly to the Egyptian chronology. They're dating it not through radiocarbon dates, but they're dating it through the Egyptian chronology. and they find that it suddenly lost, 2/3 of its inhabitants. So probably an army came through and killed everybody, but something happened that it collapses. In that case, if it's tied to the Egyptian chronology, if that's how they're dating that event, then yes, I totally just shift it, right? And it's actually like, I'm looking at my thing here. So it's actually like the Babylonians coming through. And like in my chronology, the Hittites, right, which we read about in all of these 19th kingdom, 19th dynasty records, like that's the Lydians. And this is again where you find like this repeat of history. And I'm saying, well, that repeat is actually the same thing. They just have different names. And in this case, yeah, the Bronze Age collapse, where you have all this destruction, is actually just being moved. And it is now the Babylonians going through and just killing everyone. But on the other hand, if you are dating something like Santorini or like the Iceland volcanic eruptions so they sometimes try to tie to the Bronze Age collapse, and these things, they're not dating through any kind of correlation with Egyptian history. They're dating them through radiocarbon dates. Then in that case, it's like, well, no, you're talking about a different collapse now. And that's why there's not complete agreement in all the Bronze Age collapses too. If you got to read it, there's different events that some people, that's why there's such debate. And like, was it an army that did all this? Or was it natural disasters that did all this? Was it Santorini or was it the Iceland volcanoes? Like everyone comes at this from a different angle and uses kind of a different anchor point for their dates. And so I say you have to actually look and see what they're dating it with. Because if they're dating it with a radiocarbon date and it's not tied at all to the Egyptian chronology, well, then it's a different event than what I'm saying, right?
And there's no way that you can transform the radiocarbon dates from something like the Santorini eruption or from the Icelandic eruption and then bring it in line with the dates that are tied to the Egyptian chronology, is what you're saying.
You can and you can't. So if you're using radiocarbon, but you can't directly debate a volcanic eruption with radiocarbon, right?
Because
So
the only thing that you can date is like there was some kind of organic matter that was buried at the time of the eruption.
Exactly. Yeah, if you're trying to directly date it or try to use an ash flow or some kind of Tefra chronology, then you're going to be using your uranium series or something, a geologic dating method, argon, potassium argon, or uranium series. So anyway, if you're using a radiocarbon date though, then since I have a correlated curve now, since I think that the Entcal curve is wrong, that it goes 250
What is the Entcal curve? Sorry.
Okay, so Entcal is kind of the most popular, the dominant correlation curve for radiocarbon dating. Because early in history, especially when it comes to that Hallstatt plateau that we talked about, archaeologists in the Middle East were realizing like these dates don't match at all. Like I'm getting this radiocarbon date and it is not matching with my known historical date at all. And so they realized, oh, we got to correlate these. So obviously there was something throwing off the expected radiocarbon results because there's probably a solar flare or something going on with the sun that was changing the amount of radiocarbon being produced.
Which so, to like make a point of this is kind of crazy because it's like hundreds of years.
Yeah. I mean, in most cases, the Entcal curve is only off by, 20, 50 years, but during that Hallstatt plateau, it's off by up to 400 years. And then after the Hallstatt plateau, then they try and get it to be like kind of normal again. And then it goes to about 250 years off. And I'm saying, well, yeah, and it's off 250 years, the opposite direction that they're even saying. Your correlation is totally wrong because you're basing it on a manethochronology that you had wrong. That's a manethochronology that's actually based on Josephus, who's religiously trying to make the Hyksos into Moses. And so you're using the Bible to create a correlation curve to base your entire scientific argument on, which is wrong. And now it's actually overturned the very Bible you used to create it in the first place. Like, oh, I got to just throw it all out and start over again and recreate your correlation curve. And I think there's a lot of evidence for mine being like has some pretty awesome stuff. And I hope to really flesh it out at one point. I mean, this is like so much work and so much research, but I hope to really write it. But it matches fairly well with what Velikovsky proposed 50 years ago, and he had a pretty good amount of research to like prove his correlated curve. It doesn't match it at all with like the Rohr chronology. There's a lot of other people who've done kind of religious adjustments. I think that Velikovsky was pretty right, and he's got some great arguments, and mine follow in that vein. And I didn't use his research at all to come up with mine. In fact, I'm not even sure that it's exactly on. I'm just every time I find his stuff, it's like, well, I think that goes along pretty close with mine.
Do you think that any of the Homeric stuff points to these events as well? Or was that later?
like a lot of those, like, so whether it be Homer or whether it be Herodotus's references to some of those writers, they, like, I don't think Homer gives exact dates, if I remember right, very much at all.
I would doubt it. Yeah.
But when it comes to his writing on the Battle of Troy, this would completely change that. Like this chronology would change that, because that has been, like, Egyptian chronology is the anchor that the entire Mesopotamian chronology has been hung on, and that the radiocarbon calibration curve has been hung on. Like, Egyptian chronology is incredibly important, because if it's wrong, our entire history for the Near East is wrong. In fact, our entire history for the world, because the radiocarbon correlation curves that are based on Manetho, essentially, on the Egyptian chronology, go across the entire world. So they're doing those same correlations often in the Americas that they're doing in the Near East based on what they're finding with Manetho.
Okay, so let me make sure that I understand this. Manetho puts together this chronology of the Egyptian kings, and you were saying that I wrote this down, Manetho is in 300 BC. And so he's in Egypt. He's basically going around to all of these temples, collecting whatever historical records they have, and assembling some sort of final document that describes these things. And then later there is Josephus, and other historians that are referencing the Manetho's chronology. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to put the biblical stories onto this Egyptian king list. But obviously this is early. Josephus is, you were saying that he was like right around the time of Christ, so he doesn't have a ton of archaeological data to go off of. He's kind of just looking at these stories and trying to correlate them. And then if we're going to skip over like more than almost 2 millennia, and you get to the point where people have radiocarbon dating, and so what they're doing is they're looking at these original chronologies that were mapped to the king lists, and also in the circular way, also mapped to biblical chronologies. And then they constructed the scientific calibration curves off of this set of circular chronologies. And it's misdated not just the Middle East and Egypt, but it's literally been applied across the entire world. And you're like, there seems to be evidence to point to this being a period of like 500 years that's completely mislabeled in the historical record. And so all of our understanding for this period of 500 years is totally off.
Yeah. And it's a huge ask, because on top of that, we have the dendrochronology records that an entire scientific framework is based on this Egyptian chronology. And in some cases...
Elaborate on that. What do you mean about the dendrochronology?
So there's dendrochronology records in the Near East, in Egypt.
Those are tree rings for all you normal people out there.
Where they've tried to get year-by-year resolution, right, and use the dendrochronology to prove the Egyptian timeline, right? And so originally, most of those dendrochronology things were based on the established Egyptian timeline. And so now they're creating a correlation curve that not only has dendrochronology wrong, but also the radiocarbon correlation curve wrong. But then in some cases, we get these alternate dendrochronology records, like of oaks in Northern Europe, or maybe America, and especially when it comes to America, well, now, are they based on the Egyptian chronology too? Well, that depends. That depends on what they're using. Like, who did they use to correlate exactly with? When you create a dendrochronology records, and I don't even know if there are any that people use, and there's lots of them for after the time of Christ, obviously, with the Anasazi and the Southwest cultures, but I don't know if there's a lot of dendrochronology that you used at 1000 BC, in this window that I'm recreating, which is 500 BC to 1500 BC, which would be the Olmec period in the New World. There's not a lot of dendrochronology that's been done, but I think I've seen it done. It has been done. And so it's like, for that particular study, are they basing their dendrochronology on radiocarbon dates that are hung upon a matching dendrochronology in the old world that has been hung upon or matched to Manetho's timeline, which I say is wrong, right? There's all these assumptions that a lot of these studies are built on. And sometimes it's really hard to get to the bottom of the methodology of that particular study and be like, okay, well, what are you basing these dates on exactly? What are you basing? Is there a different a different correction that needs to happen for the IntCal radiocarbon correlation curve in the New World versus the radiocarbon correlation curve in the Old World. I think it's I would say I don't know, but I would say for sure there's a reason why a lot of archaeologists in the ancient world and the Near East, both in Egypt, but especially in Mesopotamia, when it comes to certain ages, like between 500 and 1500 BC, they just don't even trust radiocarbon dates.
Yeah, I mean, that makes, like, anytime that you look at an article that's discussing radiocarbon dates, and especially if you look at the summaries of what happens in the Hallstatt Plateau, this has always been something that seemed a little weird to me, because they're basically like, oh, we have this date that we get from radiocarbon dating, and the way that we know that it's off is in part by matching it to known historical events. And that's like, well, wait a second. We don't have a universal accounting of historical events and the dates that things happened at. And so if we're wrong about the sequence of any of those dates, then it does seem like there's this huge free parameter that suddenly emerges. And so I guess one of the biggest things here is that the document that you're pointing to as being a historical anchor document is the Bible. And I don't really know much in terms of whether or not people trust it as a historical source. Like, is it well accepted that the Bible is describing events that actually happened? Or is it that there's some events that they kind of point to and they're like, well, that probably did happen, but then there's this other stuff that we assume is just kind of, because you were saying like King David is viewed as being this kind of apocryphal character because there's no record of him conquering. Okay, and so you're making the case that the Bible is much more of an accurate historical document than we give it credit for.
Yeah, at least back to David. That's my assertion. I think that a large consensus ends up being that the Bible is trustable back to the Kings period, back to 600 BC. Like most people agree on that because there's so much other history and it all kind of matches the Bible. You know, even though the Old Testament really only goes from like, I don't know if you count Maccabean period to about 600 BC. They trust that. They trust that because it's validated. But I'd say that most of the archaeologists now, and I don't know if it's most, but I think probably a larger percentage of archaeologists now do not trust the Bible from about 800 BC, because we've got some relics of Hezekiah in Israel that validate Hezekiah. But once we get before Hezekiah and Amos, there isn't much between him and David. And there's really no evidence of David when it comes to matching with the scope of what the Bible says of his empire, right? There's just evidence right there in Israel. So that's where most archaeologists now do not believe the Bible. At Hezekiah, they think that they don't even know exactly what the dating are, but they debate it. And at David, they throw it out completely because they're like, well, there's just not a lot of evidence of David doing what the Bible said he did.
What's the biblical timeline?
Unless you're a Christian, who believes in it for religious reasons, and then for sure you find ways to say, oh, these correlate perfectly. Yeah, there's a debate there. So,
well, sure, okay. I mean, that seems reasonable. I was just, I imagine that most people who read the Bible are not also digging through radiocarbon dates, and so if they do believe what it says, it like whether or not the radiocarbon dates match doesn't.
Yeah,
I think that there's a relatively small number of people that are preoccupied with that.
Yeah, but and if there are, they just realize, well, the radiocarbon dates are wrong.
So what's the gap between David and Hezekiah in terms of, in the biblical chronology? How many years are we talking?
About 250-ish years in there, 200, 300 years.
Okay, and so you think that that's an accurate 250 years?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the thing that needs to be sort of brought to match the chronology is just that the archaeological events are happening at like 500 years earlier or later? Later, you're saying?
Yeah, 500 years later than what Manetho and the accepted chronology says, right? So my whole thing, Amos was not at 1500 BC. He was at 1000 BC. Amos did not coexist with Moses. Amos coexisted with David. The Hyksos are not Moses. The Hyksos are the Amorites, Amalekites, and David. David and Solomon.
I mean, that's pretty crazy. I think it's possible.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that Velikovsky kind of says the same thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay. So I don't know
which
anything
book is
about
this? Yeah,
Velikovsky.
I only know the
Worlds in Collision.
and only I haven't read it. I
Let
just
me-
know about it from the EU
Okay.
people.
If you just do a
We're
he
exposing
wrote-
our
he wrote
ignorance
like 5
left and
different
right here.
books. But yeah, I haven't read all his books either. But I think like if you just Google Velikovsky's revised Egyptian chronology, I'm sure it'll give you his book. And the parts of it that I've read through, I was like, wow, this seems really, he has a lot of evidence. That's cool. And it seems to go along with what I'm finding independently.
Does he talk about his reasoning behind it as
Oh
well?
yeah. You know, I mean, his book's pretty long. I mean, he was a thorough scientist. I like his stuff. Yeah, and we talked about in our other thing, you know, it's like where I'm a geologist. I don't subscribe to the level of catastrophism that he does. But he's got a lot of awesome stuff. I definitely respect him as a historian and scientist. I think he did great work for the age that he lived in.
Einstein liked him.
Did he? I thought that was Hapgood.
I mean, more googling is necessary. I'm pretty sure Einstein endorsed him originally at some point.
Well, he
I mean,
endorsed.
they all lived about the same time, so I wouldn't be surprised if he talked about him. I mean, Einstein's a little
really
earlier, but
I mean, man, it's so. I don't totally know what to do with this because it seems possible. I mean, especially because the story that you're telling about this nested reference points of both historical characters and like religiously motivated characters in history. I'm like, yeah, that seems patently obvious that happens all the time. And so I don't necessarily know that it's unreasonable or even unbelievable. Like I have a hard time with some of these presentations because people make them and I'm like, yeah, I don't
maybe. Yeah.
Like I don't see why not.
If it's not a topic you want to like go down that rabbit hole, and it's like, and that's how I feel toward, you know, like the whole Egyptian stuff that what's his use it, the English.
Oh, the Hancock guy, yeah.
Hancock. I don't know why I can never remember Hancock's name. Same thing. It's kind of like, yeah, maybe.
Apparently, there's a book in the Princeton Library that contains all of Einstein and Velikovsky's unpublished letter exchanges.
Field trip.
But I guess Einstein didn't like the Venus theory very much.
I would be interested because Velikovsky is very, very much a catastrophist, right? I mean, and like I say, his catastrophism is way too much for me. But what it is ages and chaos. I think that's like the Egyptian chronology. But I think that it's interesting, you know, and he's doing, you know, I mean, I have my religious views and they definitely inform my science. Velikovsky for sure had religious views and is trying to inform his science. But honestly, even people who are a-religious are obviously kind of have an ideology that's informing their science. It's kind of hard to get away from that. I'm fine with if the Bible, like I definitely don't believe that Noah's flood is literal. Like absolutely not. I don't believe that Adam lived 4,000 years ago. I don't think the earth is 6,000 years old. I don't believe any of that. So I would have no problem like saying that David, you know, didn't happen like the Bible said. Like I have no problem with that.
It's really interesting that you say that you think that the flood story is not literal because I feel like I've heard that the floods, I've heard from many directions that the idea of the flood is a myth that probably points to something that is a historical event. The question, I guess, is whether or not it's at that exact time.
That would be my contention too. And at what was its scale? So the idea that the mountains were covered, you know, that it covered Mount Everest. But was there a flood? Like, and this is an interesting thing I just read
a lot of
recently.
floods, honestly.
There's a cool medieval history, and I love history. I just devour history. But there's a medieval history called like Benjamin Tredadu. Look up Benjamin. If you type in Tredadu, it'll probably give you the right one. And he's this Jewish chronicler of the medieval period, and he goes on this like journey through from Spain to France to North Africa to the Middle East to Persia, and then all the way over to India, and just tells about all these Jewish settlements, right? And what's really interesting in his story is he tells about Noah's Ark and exactly where it's found. And he says that there is a mosque at that period. This is like 900 AD or something like that. He said that there was both a synagogue still at that point and a mosque that were built right next to the Ark. And it wasn't at Ararat. Like everyone now is like, all the religious people right now are like, yeah, Noah's Ark is up on Mount Ararat in the top of Turkey. And it wasn't there. It was way down low, just above Mosul, Iraq. Like I was looking at the elevation and it's at like 600 to 1,000 feet above sea level. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. He's talking about this, like he's saying at 1,000 AD, like, yeah, there's parts of the ark are still there and they've disassembled parts of it and built a mosque and a synagogue by it at 1,000 AD, which blew my mind because I never heard anything like that. You know, I've heard these things at Mount Ararat where they say there's this little piece of wood and it's all so baloney that it makes me a little ill. You know, it's like, that's just total baloney. Everything I see about it baloney. But this guy is talking about it like as legit. And I'm like, huh, well, totally different from what people think today. But is it possible that a tsunami, like, because that's not very far above sea level. And if you had a massive tsunami that came into the Persian Gulf and just completely decimated that entire civilization, the whole Babylonian civilization, it probably would end up resting right where he said the ark was, which is way down low, right there at Mosul, Iraq, just on the edge of the mountain. So then it's like, well, that's more believable. I could believe that. I could get on that. And maybe there was an even bigger one way back in the ages past. There's probably been thousands. You look at how many meteorite impacts there are on the moon, and then think how many meteorites have probably hit the earth through history, and how many times there's been tsunamis that have just completely decimated civilizations.
We did a cool podcast with this Columbia scientist who was documenting some of these on the African coast. It was pretty cool. Dallas Abbott, yeah. Plus, I mean, those freaking glaciers were melting at some point. That must have been nuts.
Yeah, the Younger Dryas and the end of the Ice Age, the amount of sea level change that happened just in a couple hundred years at the end of the Ice Age. I mean, for sure, I think there is probably a cultural memory. And maybe our radiocarbon dates are totally off, and maybe it happened instead of 12,000 BC, maybe the Younger Dryas happened at 6,000 BC. There's all sorts of options we could explore. And I do think that the Bible is rooted in truth. But like I say, I have no bone to pick with it being completely wrong in the times of David until I had this thing in the Kolbrin. And then I start looking into it and start finding all these correlations that are just really interesting and very convincing to me that it's like, I think we're off by 500 years. I think this solves a lot of problems. I think this would actually make the scientists happy. The religionists happy. I think that David was legit. Lots of super interesting stuff. You can check out my timeline and then look forward for about 20 years for me to write a book on it. And hopefully maybe that'll add some value to this whole throw my ring into this argument, this whole revised Egyptian chronology.
I have a somewhat tangential question. Why do you think that it is important for a book like the Bible to have so much historical information in it? Like, if I was writing a mythological,
starting your own religion?
If I was starting my own, actually, now that I think about it, this is, so people accuse us of trying to start a cult all the time. Full disclosure, we are not trying to start a cult, but I do think that there is, if there was like a centerpiece of what it is that we're trying to do, is we're trying to like reimagine the way that we understand the paradoxical interpretations of quantum physics. And so we're like looking at all of these things and we're like, okay, well, this is probably what this means. This is, when you look at the wave function, this is what it represents, and this is what charges, etc. And as I asked that question, I realized that, like, how do we begin the book? We begin with a history. And so do you think that there's just something that's really vital about being able to provide some kind of baseline knowledge for the stories that you tell afterwards? Or do you think that they're used as, like, tools?
I think it's huge. And I think Josephus is the great evidence of how important this was. Because the reason why he wrote his On the Antiquity of the Jews is basically as an answer to Manetho. And they were all politically motivated because in that age, each of these cultures and nations, right, which their nations were essentially religious cults. Even Rome, you were worshiping the emperor. He was the son of God. Like these nations are indeed religious cults. They were all fighting with each other, having like a pissing match, saying we are the most ancient. And our record, because we have the true record that tells all the way to the ancients, we have a chronology, we have the Greeks were doing it, the Egyptians were doing it, and the Israelites were doing it. And they all were trying to vindicate and validate their religious views because they had these ancient records. So whether the Bible is true or not is actually pretty important because we're still having that pissing match today. And the Jewish record won although there's still a pretty strong argument for the Greeks, and their records of the ancients, and now there's still people fighting for the Egyptians that it's more right than the Hebrew one. But this is a very ancient pissing match where everyone wants to use their history to validate their religion. And I mean, with just cause, because if the book that tells about their history is wrong, then what does that say about the words in that book that tell about what their gods told their prophets? But let me get to one other really cool part, because we pull the Kolbrin into this, because the Kolbrin is another hat in that ring, because it gives a lot of cool history. And what it says of Egypt, and kind of what we can assume from Israel anyway, is pretty cool, because it gives this account that goes along with what, if you've read OASP kind of talks about this. Let's not get into OASP. It's a whole another can of worms. It's got its own history. But the Kolbrin talks about these twice born people. And what they did is they had this kind of like, I wish I could remember the exact wording that the Kolbrin puts, but basically they had a school of the adepts, and they would put them in these tombs, and they would have near-death experiences. So it talks about kind of their near-death experiences, how their prophets would go into some kind of a state. And in one case, it says they eat some kind of a hyssop or some kind of interesting plant. So they're probably using some kind of drugs to help them get into some kind of hallucinogenic state, that then after that, they're able to write these really profound, and they are profound. Like the Kolbrin has some really awesome wisdom texts in it. Like as far as religious, like wisdom text literature, like the Avesta I was talking about, really great stuff. And their prophets are saying, well, the way that I'm getting it goes all the way back to Egyptian times, of this school of how they would train their religious adepts to go into these trances, and even be able to like go into to sarcophaguses, and then people would do stuff outside the sarcophagus and they would see it.
Somebody just presented, our friend Red presented a theory on paradigm drift most recently, that the sarcophagi were sensory deprivation tanks, essentially.
I mean, yeah, basically.
Wow, vindicated. Was this, but you do you see this as an illustration of a larger point?
I don't know. As far as that goes, I just think it's interesting. I mean, it makes me want to do some LSD, maybe. I don't know.
You're like, makes me want to take some hyssop and get into sarcophagus.
If different religious persuasions go into these states and get the same view of history and of the past, hey, that's cool.
Collective unconscious strikes again.
Yeah, but for now, I mean, I like just, let's stick to the science, and as far as the science goes, that's what I'm most interested in. I think it's fascinating, and I really want to push this revised chronology, because I think it's got some amazing correlations. I hope it gain a little bit of traction. People check it out.
Do you think that it undermines any? I don't know how to ask this in a way that's not inflammatory, or that doesn't result in, but perhaps it's okay. Like, do you think that it revises the claims that people can make historically about the region? Like, do you think that and how does it do that?
It's the same history, but as soon as you change it by 500 years, it's a big ask. Like, it really is, because when you change it by 500 years, you have 500 years that you have to say that basically people who lived contemporaneous to each other, that they were stacked on top of each other temporarily. When they
he's basically saying the high era of Egypt is synonymous with the high era of the kings in the Bible, and that it was one more or less continuous culture across them.
Yeah.
So it does, in some sense, threaten the Egyptian, what would you say, claim to that culture, in the same way that, Graham Hancock's taking away the pyramids from the Mesoamericans.
Yeah, that's big. And it's pretty big to say that like the 20th through the 23rd dynasty weren't sequential. They were contemporaneous. Right? Because if you take something that supposedly happened at 1500 BC and you're saying it actually happened at 1000 BC, now you have 500 years of that chronology that you don't know what to do with. That you have to be like, well, what about this 500 years that we have? And I say it was all contemporaneous. These people were sub-kingdoms that all existed at the same time, and you stacked them on top of each other. And Manetho actually says that. He actually says, I probably did this in some places. And it's like, yeah, I say you did that. And the place where you did it is in that period of like about 600 BC to about 1000 BC in the predominant model. They didn't happen. They happened contemporaneously. They didn't happen like you think they happened.
That adds a nice missing piece in for me, because I was like, oh, what happened to these 500 years? Are they just missing?
And it's a pretty big deal too, because some of those pharaohs are mentioned in the Bible, right? And so it's like you've got, what is it, Shabiko or whatever. There's 2 or 3. Osorkon that they think is like, there's a number of those that are mentioned. I say, well, yeah, they're talking about a pharaoh that during that period, Egypt was fragmented, and so had all of these contemporaneous pharaohs, and he's talking to one of them, and yet you've stuck them all on top of each other. And it's hard to even visualize that unless you like actually see my chronology and see how it's like, well, all the main ones I kind of keep how they are, and it's these ones that are during these periods that don't have very much history that I'm kind of flattening out. And the Rohr chronology does it in his way, and I think he's totally wrong. And Velikovsky's chronology does it in a way the same as mine. I hope more people throw their hat in this ring, because I think it's really worth pursuing. I think people have stopped pursuing it. I think people think like I did when I first looked at it. It's like, oh, this is solved. When you look into it, it's like, no, it's not solved. It's not solved. The radiocarbon dates are not as big of a home run as you think they are. It's not solved.
I think that's the coolest part of any kind of scientific endeavor, is that you come into a place and everybody tells you that, nah, man, this is done. Like, we've put the bow on it, we can file it on the shelf, and we never have to touch it again, and we've awarded medals and honors for this, and let's just move on. And then somebody comes around and they're like, well, I don't think that's totally true. Like, I found this just recently in the history of physics. There was, Michael Faraday had spent 20, 30 years trying to prove that you could modify the wavelength of light with magnets. And I think it was like 60 years later, some kid in a Dutch lab was like, well, let me try it again. He had a stronger magnet. He had a better way of resolving the spectrum. And he saw that you could. But it was just, he literally, like in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he's like, look, I didn't think that I was smarter than Faraday. I didn't mean to like reopen the dustbin of history, and yet he discovered something that's like absolutely instrumental in the entire story of how physics develops, because he's basically like, well, I don't know, I have this really strong magnet, let's see. And so I don't know, I think that that's how cool stuff happens.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, man. I'm looking forward to the book on this.
Yeah, it
Start writing now.
The audacity to challenge the predominant narrative to move the science along.
Yeah. And I hope to see a world that's just filled with people who do it for the love of the game, not for the fact that there's, some university post that you might get for it, but just because it's a subject that you love and you want to be able to actually figure out how it fits together, because I think that that's the lever that moves the world.
Yeah.
And so that's really cool.
And I'll have to take some of these articles and post them on my UtahGeology.com that I kind of mentioned last time, because I have my pole shift hypothesis from the UtahGeology.com.
You have like a secret blog that you maintain.
Yeah, and then I have my religious blog, which is gathered in one, and that's where I'm trying to reform my religion. But I mean, I kind of like to try and keep these things a little separate from religion, because, like I said, I don't really care if David is off or not. So I don't want people to think that I'm doing that for a religious motif. And like I say, this is kind of similar, because remember when our episode we did that I talked about pole shift and that very strong evidence for pole shift, where the continental glacier was centered upon Greenland, right? I don't know if you guys remember all that, but it's like
we reference it like once a week.
I mean, that evidence is so
I show your figures to my students in my university class. There you go.
I'm glad, because all it takes is seeing it once. Like, you see it once, and I saw it from somebody else, right? And it's like, once you see it, you can't let it go. You can't ever see the world the same. And it's so awesome to have something that's like that you see it once, and now it changes your entire worldview. And once again, I totally disagree with Velikovsky, and because he tells some of the same ideas when it comes to like worlds in commotion, and I totally disagree with his timeline. And that's cool. That's science. We should all disagree. But I can't get away from the fact that, there's something here. Like, look at that ice cap. And it's the same thing. Look at this timeline. I just want so many, like, if young people and students can look at some of these things, whether it's the Mesoamerican correlations between the Old World and New World, pre-Columbian Trans-Oceanic travel, you see them once and you're like, whoa, that's crazy. I can't dismiss that. Whether it's the Ice Age, ice cap over Greenland instead of the North Pole, and you see it once and you're like, whoa, I need to explore this. Our worldview is wrong. Or whether it's this new Egyptian chronology that opens a whole can of worms. I love it. Hope people just look at them and be like, whoa, hey, this is a whole nother world of exploration. Let's dive in. It's not all solved. Let's dive in and like advance the science. Do it rigorously, but advance the science.
I love that.
Absolutely.
You should absolutely write this stuff up, man. Like we had a guy on the show recently who built a bubble fusion reactor in his house and spent like 5 years working it out, and he published it in Nature. Not associated with the university, just like a devoted amateur who was careful and had solid evidence, and
He was like really committed to talking himself out of it too. I think that's why he succeeded, because he just couldn't talk himself out of it eventually.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And like I think that these are ideas that more people need to wrestle with, because the presentation that you give is compelling enough that I'm like, I think you might be right, but it's one of those places where I don't know how to evaluate it. And so just putting it out in the world and having it get more eyes on it, I think is probably the most effective way, because you can always tell if somebody actually has a legitimate opposition to an idea or if it's a knee-jerk reaction. Like the things that you were talking about, the Rational Wiki. It's like, well, you didn't read the book. You're not actually offering any kind of legitimate criticism about the contents of it. It's just some kind of personal attack. And so it's like, if these ideas are out there and they're put in front of people who know about it, I do really genuinely trust in the fact that people's minds can change. And it would be really cool if you would be the one that could do it.
Yeah, hopefully I'll get there.
That'd be really cool.
Awesome.
All right, Lance, we'll let you get on with your evening. This has been awesome, as always. I'm sure you'll be back with some other mind-bending theory in a year or so.
I think we have like the history of Mormonism still ahead of us. Like this is,
That could be a fun one.
I think that would be really fun.
For sure. Because I think they're totally wrong too.
Yeah.
I've got everything I put my mind on. I'm always, I don't know, that's just my mind. Is it's like, I think that like 90% of the world out there is right, but I love to search out the things that don't quite make sense and that aren't quite right on, and just like, all right, let's advance that science. Let's adjust that. Let's fix that.
That's a really beautiful intuition.
Yeah, really cool. Yeah, let's do it again, man. It was too long between conversations last time, so hopefully we'll see you again sooner than that.
Awesome. Yeah, let's do it.
All right, well, have a good rest of your night.
Okay, you too, guys.
Bye, Lance.
Bye, everybody.
All right,
Bye,
bye.
folks.